In titling this lecture, What is There?, I realize I'm playing into the well-established prejudices of the many against philosophy, prejudices according to which philosophers spend most of their time raising questions that everybody has ready answers to, and that no sane person would have thought about asking anyway. What is there is answered by as many things as we can point to. There are carpets and doors and puppies and people and all the rest of what fills out our cluttered world. So the answer to the question, what is there, is look around. Well, of course, philosophers too look around and otherwise live their lives as others do. They do look around, but they then press on to determine whether they can trust what it is they're seeing, or whether behind what they're seeing there might be something more fundamental, something more ultimate. In the process, the philosophically inclined, seeing what is there, may also wonder, in a disciplined way, whether it's really there, or whether the very process of perception has transformed the real object into something of a distortion. Now, ancient man engaged in spearfishing and must have learned pretty early that the actual location of the fish in the water is not quite where the fish is perceived to be. We all from time to time have to learn how to adjust to the fact that our senses might deceive. But then the question is whether they always deceive, and how it comes about that we would be able to discover this. Might all the things we take for granted as having real being actually be just apparitions or manifestations of a peculiar sort? And behind such apparitions, might we be able to find something worthy of the title reality? So again, what is there? This is an example of a metaphysical question. Now, in the course of these lectures, such questions will be persistent, so this would seem to be the right time to define metaphysics. And in matters of this sort, the brief dictionary definitions are not particularly helpful. So let's begin at the beginning. When does the word begin to be used? In a monumentally important treatise composed by Aristotle, the great philosopher notes, for the benefit of his students, that they have just completed a systematic consideration of nature, or what we would call the physical world. Now, the words for this subject are physis and physikos, nature and what is natural. Now, centuries later, commentators, giving titles to Aristotle's major works, noted this reference and adopted as a phrase to refer to the treatise that came next, meta ta physica, which translates simply as after the natural science work, after the physics. Thus, this most subtle and original of philosophical works receives as its formal name one that simply places it after another work. But what's in a name? The actual subject matter of the work, known as Aristotle's Metaphysics, is the subject of real existence. And more needs to be said here by way of definition. A fairly settled understanding is that metaphysics embraces two primary sets of questions. One set, as Willard Van Orman Quine, the Harvard logician, put it, is exhausted by three monosyllabic English words. What is there? This part of metaphysics is called ontology, from the Greek on, which just is being. Ontology is the branch or division of metaphysics concerned with questions regarding the constituents of reality as such. Do ghosts and witches really exist? Any number of complex issues are then generated. Something may exist merely accidentally, or by being the effect of a cause, or even in some sense, necessarily. And as an object undergoes change, there arises the ontological question as to whether the original still exists, or could exist, etc. Now, most will agree that there are neither ghosts nor witches as such. But what about minds and thoughts? Are there minds and thoughts? Or are they just peculiar states of the brain that we describe in a mentalistic language? Do thoughts really exist? Which is to say, are thoughts bona fide ontological entities? Or are they merely terms of art, hearkening to a period of superstition and ignorance? How does one go about answering such questions? Now, presumably, through some mode of inquiry. But what is the right mode of inquiry? Should we answer the question, what is there, by making observations? That is, what there is just what we can see, touch, hear, taste, smell? Well, if we adopt that method, then surely there can't be quarks, neutrons, protons, or anything at the subatomic level. Now, as it happens, the maximum visual sensitivity of the honeybee is in a region of is actually in the ultraviolet region of the spectrum, where we can't see anything at all. So the ontology of the honeybee is radically different in content from our ontology. This is surely an unsatisfactory state of affairs. It would make no sense to say that what really exists varies from person to person, from sighted to blind persons, from persons with normal to persons with defective hearing, from persons to honeybees, etc. We surely resist the conclusion that things come into being and go out of being depending upon what sensory apparatus might be at work at a given time. This deeper implication of all this is that there is far more to reality than meets the eye, or that is accessible to any of our senses. So, what is there is a philosophical question. Like all worthy philosophical questions, it's anything but idle. And when we consider the ontological questions implicit in the famous maxim recorded at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, the maxim "know the theauton," know thyself, we are driven to ask, what am I? What sort of being am I? What am I made of? What am I made for? Now, I say, if the method of observation is insufficient, are there any other methods? Pythagoras was fairly confident that he had a method. The method was an essentially abstract mathematical method by which to discover and create coherent relationships constitutive of all possible realities. Observation as such takes no part in any of this. The method, if we may call it that, is largely intuitive and rational. We might call it an abstract rationalistic method. Now, with at least these two methods of approach to the problem of knowledge, we are left with the task of choosing. But then this would seem to require some other method or device with which to make choices between various methods. There is here a worrisome infinite regress that seems to be lurking. The rationalistic method may offer a conception of an account of reality that is not supported at the level of perception. Which account is to be preferred, and on what basis? These are questions not about real being, but about the basis upon which we claim and defend our knowledge of reality. We say that these are what? These are epistemological questions. To declare that the senses deceive, or are incapable of reaching certain levels or aspects of reality, is to make an epistemological claim. Now, presumably, if we're sure that the senses deceive us, we must possess some non-deceptive, and one would think non-perceptual, mode of discovery against which we can weigh the claims of the senses and say, alas, the senses got it wrong. Now, the only way we can say this with confidence is if we have some non-deceptive, or as we say, veridical mode of registering the truth or the facts of the world. What would that be? Is it logic? Is it mathematics? Science? Religion? Revelation? Intuition? General agreement? By vote? By custom? These are epistemological questions, and the root of this adjective is the Greek episteme, which refers to systematic knowledge. Not the mere assembly of facts, but the organization of facts and principles in such a way as to provide a systematic understanding of things, a systematic understanding of events. Taking off from this etymological root, we employ the term epistemology to stand for the study, criticism, and refinement of our very modes of knowing, the study of our knowledge as such. Now, many of our most significant claims are actually beliefs rather than knowledge. We believe, for example, that the laws of science which worked up to this very moment will still be operating tomorrow, and will permit us to move ourselves and other objects with the aid of, for example, the internal combustion engine. To be precise, we must admit that we cannot actually know what tomorrow will bring. Clearly, however, our belief in the continuing operation of the laws of nature is different from a mere guess. Now, how do we justify such a belief and distinguish it from guessing? The question pertains to what in philosophy is referred to as epistemic justification, an important area within epistemology. It must be obvious that the two branches of metaphysics, ontology and epistemology, are inextricably bound together. To answer the question, what is there, what is really there, is already to have adopted a method. To adopt a method is already to have taken a position on the sorts of things that method might uncover. So there's a continuing dialectic between the ontological and the epistemological aspects of metaphysics. It is not solely in the philosophy seminar that these matters tax the intellectual resources. In daily life, ordinary citizens are plagued, and they recognize themselves as tested by ontological and epistemological questions. Can I trust rumors? Should I believe what I read in the newspaper? What do we really mean by poverty? Is there such a thing as victimless crime? What medical advice is really sound? How do we know that the counsel of the wise is wisdom itself? What standard do we use against which to weigh those things that prevail on us for our allegiance and our belief, our convictions? Do I die with my body, or might there be a life after this one? Is there some transcendental realm above the realm of materiality in which one meets the saints of the world? Is there such a thing as goodness, really? Or is this simply a habit and a certain form of speech that a particular tribe uses to describe what it likes? Is there a moral reality, such that moral questions can be settled once and for all? Is there moral objectivity? When we use moral language, are we referring to something that has bona fide ontological standing? Now, as we begin to supply answers to questions such as this, we've adopted a method, consciously or by blind habit. And we may discover too late that the answers we've reached were more or less guaranteed, given the method we chose. Metaphysical analysis is clearly not a game that just anyone can expect to play well. But it's a game that everyone must play 7 days a week. And it often stands as the game of life itself. We have good reasons to be thankful for those metaphysicians who have devoted themselves in a quite systematic way to helping us find the way out of one or another labyrinth. Well, again, what is there? One famous answer to this most basic of metaphysical questions was supplied by Democritus in the ancient Greek world. He's the father of one of the major ontological traditions in philosophy, that of materialism. Democritus defended the thesis that ultimate reality is but an unimaginably large number of atoms, the Greek atomos referring to that which is so small that it cannot be cut further, Democritus answers the ontological question by declaring that all that is really there are atoms and a void, atoms and the spaces between them. This answer seems utterly counterintuitive. We all have dreams and desires and thoughts and sensations. Are these atomic? Nonetheless, the ancient atomists took a firm position here. What exists, what has real existence in virtue of its atomic composition. When we see a rose or smell it, it is the result of atomic emanations, or what the Greeks called eidola. What the object impinges on is also atomic in structure. In the end, nothing transcends the level of physical materiality. What there is, finally, is material, atomic. Everything is ultimately reducible to that level. None of this is at the expense of the seeming complexity of the world, for the configurations of atoms may result in large buildings, turtles, and indeed metaphysicians. But such collections are ephemeral. Sooner or later, the fate of everything is dictated by the atomic structure of everything. When the forces that hold things together become weakened through injury or disease, the atomic structure now down, then dust thou art, to dust returneth. Now the poets tell us that dust thou art to dust returneth was not spoken of the soul. You know, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, etc. Well, what's the atomist's position on the soul? The soul, we learn, is a finer kind of atomic structure. That is, what we refer to as the spiritual domain is itself particulate, atomic, but now the ontologically real entities are just of finer stuff. Note, stuff, still stuff. If the fundamental ontological question is what is there, it may be rephrased this way. How many kinds of stuff must be assumed to account for everything that there really is? You need only refer to one kind, and that is matter. What it means to be a materialist, then, is to defend an ontological position, namely, that there is no real existent that is not material. Facing such a claim, we might then insist that it be defended with argument and evidence, and through a mode of inquiry that is proper for the task at hand. Let me stay with materialism for the moment. It's useful to point out that defenses of it often rely on evidence gathered by methods that presuppose the validity of the claim, namely, methods suited to identify and quantify matter or material things. There tends to be a certain circularity, even a vicious circularity, between the ontological position we take and the methods that we employ to vindicate or confirm, or as we like to say, objectively test it. This will be apparent in more than one major theory considered in subsequent lectures. Returning once more to the ancient atomism, if it is the case that what there is goes beyond the senses and involves particles so small that no one can see them, how do we go about the task of discovery? Obviously, the atoms have to come together in large enough ensembles to be accessible to the senses. The atomist is not skeptical about chairs and apples or people and birthday cakes. What atomism asserts has to do with the ultimate constituent of things and not their gross perceptible features. Obviously, things take on defining properties in virtue of their atomic organization. So that the next-door neighbor is different from a birthday cake, not in that the next-door neighbor is made up of something other than atomic entities, but is comprised of radically different atomic configurations. Nevertheless, it reassures this same ordinary citizen that what is perceived is really there insofar as it has an atomic configuration agreeable to our essentially empirical or sensory modes of knowing. Here is that naturalistic orientation that plays off very nicely against, for example, a Pythagorean worldview. Suppose we now raise the question, what is there in the domain of morals or politics or art? Is there in reality right and wrong? Is there in fact real beauty? Is there in fact truth and falsity in statements about good and evil? Now, to say yes or no is to trigger basic questions about the means by which answers are to be reached, the methods used to identify right and wrong, etc. Some have argued today, as well as thousands of years ago, that the ultimate grounding of morality, law, aesthetics, and principles of governance is nothing more than conventional wisdom. At work is nothing more than one's social conditioning. One's values are reflections of nothing more than the way one was raised and acculturated. Jack knows that there is right and wrong, and all Jack's friends and neighbors know that there is right and wrong, why all red-blooded Americans know there is right and wrong, but so too do all red-blooded ancient Babylonians, Aztec tribesmen, European witch hunters, Oriental believers in the divinity of their emperor. The anthropological record makes clear that there has not been a stable and universally accepted scheme of moral rectitude or aesthetic value. As we examine one tribe or culture, or one historical era or another, there seems to be wide disagreement as to questions of right and wrong, truth and falsity, good and evil. Certainly what the Greeks revered as sublimely beautiful in their commitment to harmony and proportion, balance and measure, is not what the Quacutal might regard as beautiful, with feathers sticking out and wild plumage and distortions of the body. Certainly the medieval depiction of human forms struck Renaissance painters and sculptors as hopelessly defective. The ancient Greek philosophers were not unaware of this as they attempted to find truths not otherwise discovered through the shifting perspectives of the non-philosophical world. Thales, who might be regarded as the first philosopher of note in ancient Greece, flourishing around 580 BC, reasoned that everything is composed of some sort of spirituous or watery material. His student, Anaximander, reasoned that the ultimate composition of things was neither watery nor solid, but some sort of ineffable substance. Others defended what came to be something of the conventional view, that all reality was a composite reality, the composition being of earth, air, fire, and water. But among the pre-Socratics were also those who had grave doubts about our ability to answer fundamental questions without introducing our own prejudices into the equation. Heraclitus, flourishing about 500 BC, and famous for the maxim, "No one descends twice into the same river," seeing nothing but flux and change everywhere, had yet another maxim: "The donkey prefers garbage to gold." When we turn to more systematic forms of skepticism, however, the thinker who comes to mind immediately is Protagoras, an older contemporary of Socrates, who will figure in two of the main Platonic dialogues, the one named after him, Protagoras, and another in which his teaching is critically assessed, the Theaetetus. Protagoras is famous for the maxim, "Man is the measure of all things." If philosophers ever come to grips with the fact that they're probably going to be remembered for one sentence or one merely vagrant utterance, no matter how many qualifications they added, they might choose a life of silence. Well, from Protagoras we have two gems, and we wish we had much more. First, though, is man is the measure of all things. How is this to be understood? Protagoras is a founding father of sophist thought. And we can tell from the dialogue Protagoras, which he is having with a still less than ripe Socrates, that he is a formidable philosopher. We will meet him again. But here it is sufficient to note that there is certainly more to Protagoras than the single and arguable idea that man is the measure of all things. What Protagoras is claiming is that judgments of any sort, right or wrong, true or false, beauty or ugliness, must have some grounding, and that grounding can only be the experiences of a lifetime. We cannot occupy an epistemic position external to our own human ways of thought and feeling. If there is a standard liberated from or independent of human nature, we couldn't even comprehend it. To that extent, then, each man does turn out to be the measure of all things. It's you who will decide whether this is a sweet or sour substance, and what's sweet to one person might be sour to others, or even to the same person on separate occasions. One man's fish is another man's poisson, as the pun would have it. Now, this, of course, relativizes epistemology. Understood under this light, epistemology is a fit subject for cultural anthropology or sociology. In fact, we do have a flourishing field of inquiry called the sociology of knowledge. And it's applied even to the most developed branches of science, the extent to which social values and cultural values shape and even dominate our metaphysical speculations. So Protagoras' answers to the question, what is there, are going to be guided by knowledge of the vantage point of the person making the observations and the judgments. Accordingly, if philosophical inquiry is a search after the truth, it seems that this is a misguided undertaking from the first. Truth turns out to be one of those elusive entities that finally records little more than the perspective of the individual, little more than some transpersonal or objective or transcendent, eternally true state of affairs, is certainly not going to be within reach. Not that there aren't truths of such a nature, but we're scarcely equipped to comprehend or unearth them. We do have one more bon mot from Protagoras. So much of his philosophy is lost, as is that entire system of thought developed by the pre-Socratic philosophers. All we have now can be fit into a single volume, but one suggestive enough to stimulate whole libraries of commentary. But let me go back to the second snippet from Protagoras. This is from a treatise he composed about the nature of the gods. In that treatise, he says something that always reminds me of what it is the Homeric epics are depicting as we wrestle with the problem of knowledge. Protagoras says, "About the gods, I cannot say either that they are or that they are not, nor how they are constituted in shape. There is so much that prevents knowledge of this kind, the unclarity of the subject, and the shortness of human life." Close quote. The unclarity of the subject and the shortness of human life. We are mortal. We do not live on Olympus. Our life is measured in hours, and this sets a limit on what we can know. And with respect to the gods, the ultimate source of all there is and all there could be, these are questions beyond human ken. These are matters we cannot reach. I cannot write to you about the gods. I can write to you about what I can see and hear and taste and touch. I can write to you about where I've lived and where I've visited and what I've discovered. Protagoras seems to be saying, and what I've discovered in these travels, in these journeys, in journeys of thought and journeys of body, is that opinions vary widely. And what one person is prepared to die for, in virtue of what he takes to be its truth, another regards as just another example of the absurdity of the human condition. So each one in his way becomes the measure of all things, and the possibility of a coherent transpersonal body of knowledge is ever beyond reach, if not realistic hope. Well, this really is surely a melancholy prospect for a philosophy. Put the books away, put away the pens and pencils, find another day job. If each person is the measure of all things, there can't ever be an argument. But as Socrates will show throughout his productive life, there is much to argue about, including the proposition that each person is an ultimate measure of all things. The significant contribution of philosophers before Socrates or among his older contemporaries, takes the form of robust skeptical challenges to customary beliefs. Socrates, too, examines these beliefs, but also the challenges. In the process, he shifts philosophical attention from that cosmos that so arrested the attention of the pre-Socratics, turning it into the human condition itself. He will argue that each of us not only fails to be the measure of all things, we're generally very poor in understanding our very selves. With him, philosophy now becomes an utterly humanizing and humanistic enterprise, a significant place on the map of thought from which there will be no retreating.